Welcome back to the Old Photo Vault channel. The Watchman at Drawer 7, St. Agnes Mortuary, Ohio, 2:17 a.m. I have worked nights at St. Agnes Mortuary for 12 years, long enough to trust the ordinary sounds of the building, the hum of refrigeration, the click of metal settling, my own footsteps returning to me. That night, I was finishing paperwork when I noticed Drawer 7 was open an inch. I was certain I had sealed it myself. Inside lay Mrs. Eleanor Graves, admitted just before midnight, her feet carefully wrapped, her face calm. What troubled me was the faint impression above her chest, as if someone were standing there. Close, I felt watched, not threatened, just patiently observed. I lifted my phone, meaning to document the door for the log. The screen showed more than I saw. A pale woman, upright, hands folded, looking straight at me. She seemed relieved. When I looked up, the space was empty. Drawer 7 has never stayed closed since. The figure at Pere Lachaise, Paris, France, late afternoon, autumn. I went to Pere Lachaise on my day off, telling myself it was just another photograph, another famous grave. Jim Morrison's marker was crowded with names and messages, the stone worn smooth by hands that wanted to feel closer to him. I waited until the tourists drifted away. The air felt still, heavier than the rest of the cemetery. When I framed the shot, I noticed the stone bust looked darker than it should, as if someone were standing directly behind it, blocking the light. I couldn't see anyone with my eyes. I took the picture anyway. On the screen, a thin figure appeared, half-formed, leaning forward from the shadow of the grave. Its face turned not toward the camera, but toward the name carved below. It looked familiar, restless, impatient. I remembered Morrison died at 27, far from home. The figure seemed to be waiting for something the living keep bringing, but never give. The woman outside the window, Florence, Italy. Summer 1978. I took the photograph in the late afternoon, lying back on the narrow bed in my rented room, thinking only of the heat and the way the light softened everything it touched. My friend Clara laughed when I aimed the camera toward myself, teasing me for wasting film. The window was open, the curtain barely moving. I remember feeling briefly uneasy, as if someone were standing too close behind the glass. But when I looked up, there was only the garden and the glare. It was only later, when the photo was developed, that I saw her. A tall, pale figure stood outside the window, her outline blurred, her head tilted slightly inward, as though listening. Clara swore no one had been there. The landlord later told me a woman once waited there every evening for her husband, who never returned from the river. Now, whenever sunlight fills a room too quietly, I wonder who might still be waiting to be noticed. The things that stay. A rented flat, northern England. Undated, he used to tell himself the mess was temporary. The kitchen was always meant to be cleaned tomorrow. Plates stacked in cloudy water, bottles without labels, a washing machine that smelled faintly sweet and wrong. Dust gathered in the corners where light never quite reached. It was there, between the stove and the sink, that the camera caught something he hadn't noticed while standing in the room. A child's face, pale and pressed forward, hovering among the clutter as if the objects themselves were holding it in place. He stared at the photograph longer than he meant to. The flat had once belonged to a woman who hoarded after her son died, neighbors said. She never threw anything away, not even his room. He began to understand how disorder worked, not as chaos, but as invitation. Some places become so crowded with forgotten things that the living leave no room for themselves, and something else quietly moves in instead. The shadow that belonged to no one. Suburban living room, Oregon. Christmas Eve, 1976. They stood close together for the photograph, trying to keep the hanging plant from swinging. The room smelled of pine and warm dust from the heater. A small tree blinked in the corner, and the model ship on the wall leaned slightly, as it always had. Nothing about the moment felt unusual. When the photo came back, though, the shadow appeared first. It stretched along the wall behind them, taller than any of the people in the room, its head narrow, its shoulders sloped at the wrong angle. No one could match it by standing there again. The seated man swore the light couldn't have made it. The woman said the wall felt colder afterward. Years later, the house was emptied, but the photograph remained. The shadow never shifted, never faded. It seemed less like a trick of light and more like something that had briefly joined the family, just to make sure it was remembered. The man beneath the passage. Abandoned quarry tunnel, Pennsylvania. Winter, 1989. They found the tunnel by accident. A narrow cut in the rock hidden behind brush and snow. It was meant to be a quick photograph, a proof that the old quarry still had places no one bothered to seal. The man stepped inside with a flashlight, careful with his footing, noting how the walls pressed inward as if still settling. Halfway down the passage, the beam caught a face. It was a man's, dirt-streaked and calm, standing where the ceiling had collapsed years earlier. No one remembered anyone dying there. Yet the locals later spoke of Thomas Hale, a miner buried alive when the tunnel gave way in 1932. The photo showed him clearly, framed by rubble, looking neither trapped nor surprised. Afterward, the tunnel seemed shorter, tighter. Those who returned said the rock felt warmer, as if something beneath it was still breathing, waiting to be seen again. The friend who cut the cake. Cedar Falls, Iowa, spring 1974. Margaret Lewis remembered the afternoon as perfectly ordinary. She stood at the folding table in her parents' basement, smoothing the icing before the guests arrived. The cake was too large, baked by neighbors, its edges already softening in the warm room. Her mother took the photograph as Margaret began the first cut, laughing because she felt oddly crowded at the table. Later, when the film was developed, they noticed another hand. It rested close to the knife, pale and careful, as if guiding the blade. Margaret was certain she had been alone. The space beside her had been empty. Her father grew quiet when he saw it. Years earlier, Margaret's childhood friend Helen Carter had died after a sudden illness, just weeks before her own birthday party. Helen loved helping in the kitchen. In the photograph, the cake looks evenly divided, as though no one had ever truly been missing. The one who watched the treatment. County Clinic, Massachusetts, 1911. The photograph was meant to document progress. Nurse Abigail Moore stood beside the examination chair, hands folded, while Mrs. Eleanor Price lay propped with pillows, her body wrapped and restrained according to the custom of the time. The room was clean, orderly, humming faintly with electrical equipment that promised improvement. Nothing appeared out of place. It was only when the image was developed that the observer emerged. A pale face hovered behind the treatment table, barely formed, eyes open and attentive, as if carefully studying the procedure. No one recalled a third person in the room. Abigail felt a sudden unease she could not explain, a sense of being evaluated rather than assisted. Old records later mentioned a patient named Lydia Warren, who died during an experimental therapy years earlier. Her case quietly closed. The face in the photograph does not look angry or afraid. It looks patient, as though it has been watching ever since, waiting to see if anything has truly changed. The one standing near the records. Portland, Oregon, 1986. The photograph was taken casually, meant to capture a quiet evening indoors. Linda Parker sat in her chair, one hand at her chin, listening to someone speak off camera. The room was familiar. Shelves of vinyl records, a lamp angled too low, the soft clutter of a life being lived. Nothing felt staged. When the film was developed, however, there was another presence. Behind the record shelf stood a woman, faint and elongated, her shape blurred as if caught between moments. She faced Linda, not the camera, her posture attentive, almost protective. No one remembered anyone standing there. The space behind the shelf was too narrow for a person to fit. Later, Linda recalled the apartment once belonged to an elderly tenant who spent her days listening to records after her husband died. The figure in the photograph appears patient, as though still listening, lingering where familiar sounds once made the silence bearable. 15 minutes after the crowd. Béthune, France, January 11th, 1909. The photograph was taken when the square had finally begun to empty, after the shouting thinned into embarrassed murmurs and the cold returned to its proper place. On the table lay the heads of Canute Vromont and Théophile Deroux, positioned carefully, as if care could still matter. Their faces looked calmer than anyone expected. A clerk recorded the time, noting that it had been only a quarter of an hour since the blade fell. Outside, people were still arguing about what they had seen. Some swore the eyes moved. Others said the expressions had changed. The men belonged to the Bande Paulet, criminals known for cruelty. Yet the camera flattened everything into silence. Later, officials would say the crowd that day had been too eager, too wild, and public executions would quietly pause for years. The photograph endured. It does not show violence. It shows what remains when justice finishes its work and must look at itself. The Comrade Who Returned. Eastern Front Cemetery, Poland. Autumn, 1943. The photograph had faded with the years, its edges soft. The sky washed, nearly white. Karl Heinemann kept it folded in his paybook, a picture of himself standing by a grave marker, helmet resting where a head no longer could. He remembered the day clearly. The cold soil, the smell of damp grass, the silence after the chaplain left. When the print was cleaned decades later, something new appeared. Beside Karl's shadow stood another, smaller figure. Its outline thinner, its cap tilted the way Otto Weiss used to wear his. Otto had been buried weeks earlier, lost during a night advance that never made it into reports. The figure faced the grave, not the camera, as if checking the name once more. The rest of the image continued to fade, but that shape grew sharper. It seemed the longer the photograph aged, the more determined the comrade became to be remembered as still standing there. The face in the side chapel, rural church, southern France. After sunset, the church had been closed for years, but the door still opened with the same soft complaint. The air inside smelled of stone and damp wood, familiar and almost comforting. Benches lined the nave, their surfaces worn smooth by hands that no longer came. The altar stood intact, the cross still upright, as if waiting for a service that was merely delayed. The photograph was taken without much thought, just a record of abandonment. It was only later, at home, that the face appeared. Pale, narrow, set into the right wall where plaster had peeled away. It did not belong to any statue or painting. The eyes were open, attentive, not pleading. Local records mentioned a young woman who prayed there every evening after the war, long after the priest left, until she simply stopped returning. The face seems pressed gently forward, as though listening for footsteps, patient enough to wait until someone finally looks back. The friend, above the headboard. Small bedroom, Kentucky. Late summer, 1979. The photograph was taken to remember a simple visit. Susan Miller sat on the edge of the bed, smiling the way people do when they feel safe enough not to think about the future. The room was neat, carefully chosen, matching lamp, pale curtains. The headboard painted once and never again. Nothing about the moment seemed crowded. When the film was developed, however, someone else appeared. Just above Susan's shoulder, rising from the headboard, was the faint shape of another young woman. Her outline soft, her face unfinished, as if still learning how to be seen. Susan felt a strange familiarity when she noticed it. A tug of recognition without memory. Years later, her mother mentioned Susan once had a childhood friend, Emily Hart, who slept over often before moving away suddenly after an illness. In the photograph, the figure leans close, positioned exactly where a friend would sit, careful not to wake her. The hand that still offered fire. Back courtyard, Eastern Europe. Late 1960s. The photograph shows two women, as they always were in the afternoons. Marta sat heavy on the chair, cigarette already between her lips, while Aniela leaned forward to light it, her scarf slipping, her dress patterned with worn flowers. They had done this for years, an unspoken rhythm of need and habit. Nothing about the moment felt staged. When the picture was developed, the family noticed something small and unsettling. Between the flame and the cigarette, there seemed to be another hand, thinner, paler, slightly out of place, helping to steady the light. Aniela laughed it off at first, but later she grew quiet. Her younger sister, Sophia, had died in that same doorway decades earlier, always impatient, always the first to offer a match. In the photograph, the smoke curls gently upward, as if warmed by more than one breath, as if kindness once learned does not always know how to leave. The guest who never left. Private bedroom, Missouri. Winter evening, 1962. The photograph was meant to be reassuring. Harold Bennett sat neatly on the edge of the bed, jacket buttoned, glass resting lightly in his hand, as if to prove he was doing well on his own. The room was orderly in a careful way. Lamps straightened, papers stacked, the bedspread pulled smooth. Nothing suggested company. When the picture came back from the drugstore, the shape beside him appeared slowly, almost politely. A pale figure leaned from the far side of the bed, its outline blurred, its head inclined toward Harold as though listening. He stared at it longer than he admitted. His wife, Margaret, had died in that room 3 winters earlier, after months of quiet evenings just like this one. Neighbors said Harold talked less after that, but slept more soundly. In the photograph, the mattress dips slightly on the empty side, as if someone familiar has settled there again, careful not to disturb him. The face that borrowed my reflection. Upstairs bedroom, Ohio. Spring night, 1983. I remember taking the photo because I wanted to see the dress properly. The mirror was old, slightly warped, and I had to lift my hair with one hand to make it sit right at the back. The room felt warm, ordinary, lamps glowing, perfume uncapped, my childhood toys still watching from the bed. I didn't feel alone. That was the strange part. When the film came back, I noticed the face immediately. It was not mine. In the mirror, just behind my shoulder, another woman stared out. Her features pale and incomplete, her eyes fixed on my reflection as if learning it. I stood there for a long time, comparing angles, light, distance. There was no one else in the room. My mother later told me the house once belonged to a young woman who dressed carefully but never went out. In the photo, the face looked satisfied, as though it finally did. The one who waited on the stairs. Stonehouse cellar, Burgundy, nightfall. I took the photograph because the stairs always unsettled me. They led down into the cellar, narrow and uneven, the stone walls sweating in the colder months. At the bottom hung an old wooden cross, darker than the rest of the wall, as if it absorbed what little light reached it. I told myself the place only felt strange because it was quiet. When I raised the camera, I felt a pause, like someone had stopped behind me, but I didn't turn around. The picture came out blurred, aged even then. It wasn't until later that I saw the figure, A thin shape stood midway down the steps, faint and patient, facing upward. It wasn't moving toward the cross, it was watching me. My grandmother once said a man had fallen there during the war, carrying wine down too late at night. Now I avoid the stairs. In the photograph, he hasn't climbed or descended. He is still waiting for me to follow. The one missing from the sofa. Family living room, Illinois. Christmas night, 1958. The photograph was taken just after the laughter peaked, when everyone leaned too close and forgot to pose properly. The sofa sagged under familiar weight. Coats tossed aside, glasses sweating onto the carpet. It was meant to capture happiness. Nothing more. When the film was developed weeks later, someone noticed the space behind them first. Between the man in the red bow tie and the patterned cushion, a face hovered, faint and out of time. It did not smile. It watched. No one remembered leaving room for another guest. Later, the daughter recalled an aunt who died young, always sitting slightly apart, listening more than speaking. The family said the house felt fuller in those years, warmer somehow. In the photograph, the face seems pressed gently forward, not intruding, only making sure it is still included. Long after the others are gone, it remains, patient, exactly where it once belonged. The small customer who still waits. Corner liquor store, Ohio. After closing, the store was quiet in the way only fluorescent lights can manage. Bright and empty at the same time. Bottles stood in neat rows, labels facing forward, prices unchanged for years. The clerk had stepped into the back room, leaving the register humming softly. When the security camera image was reviewed later, something stood near the counter. A small figure, thin and gray, no higher than the drawers, its head tilted up as if trying to see the screen. It did not touch anything. It simply waited. Years earlier, a child had wandered in alone on winter evenings, sent to buy milk while his mother worked late. One night, he never made it home. The store remodeled, the floors replaced, the hours extended. In the image, the figure stands exactly where the line begins, patient and practiced. The register light reflects faintly through him, as if he still expects someone to notice and ask what he needs. The one who stayed sober. Student flat, Copenhagen. Winter, 1972. The photograph was taken late, after the jokes had thinned and the room smelled of spilled beer and cold smoke. Eric tilted the bottle back, eyes closed, certain no one was watching him anymore. The door behind him was shut, the small wooden cross fixed above it as it always had been, a leftover from the last tenant. Nothing felt unusual. When the film was developed, the figure appeared near the door. Faint but unmistakable, a man stood there, upright and careful, hands folded as if waiting for permission to speak. His gaze was not on the bottle, but on Eric's face. The landlord later mentioned a former resident, Neil's home, who quit drinking and locked himself in that room through one long winter, praying each night to stay clear-headed. He died quietly, sober to the end. In the photograph, the figure remains steady, as though still keeping watch, long after everyone else has forgotten to stop. If these images unsettled you, don't look away just yet. Old photographs don't always keep their secrets, and sometimes what was forgotten finds a way back into the frame. Look closely. Did you notice the same details I did? Or did something else catch your eye? Tell me in the comments what you saw and where you saw it. If you have a strange photo of your own, or a story tied to an image you can't explain, share it below. And if you want to keep exploring these quiet, unsettling moments hidden in plain sight, make sure to like, subscribe, and stay with us. Some photographs wait a long time to be seen.